All right, so I'm really excited to bring to you guys tonight someone I really admire and respect, Dr. Rachel Schattman of the UMaine School of Food and Agriculture, and she works in the coolest lab, the agroecology lab. She's doing a lot of cool research about peer-to-peer and peer-to agriculture advisor relationships, a lot of work in water and other climate issues. She's hosted a lot of fellowships over the years that have connected people to site-specific climate adaptation tools, and we're really lucky tonight. And that we'll hand it over to you, Rachel.
Thank you so much, Meg. Thank you for the kind introduction. It's lovely to see everybody here. I am very honored to be asked to be part of this series. Can everybody see the screen at this point? It's like lovely blue themed title slide. Since we're talking about water, everything's going to be blue tonight. I wanted to start off tonight's talk by just acknowledging that when I had a commercial farm in Vermont for 11 years before I moved to Maine, and irrigation and water management was my Achilles heel completely. I was terrible at it. I had no idea what I was doing. I was undersizing pipes and miscalculating how much water plants needed. So my learning about this topic has really been born a little bit out of frustration at my own kind of lack of ability to be really effective in this one particular part of what was then a commercial production system. As a researcher, I'm really interested in how people learn and how people think about climate change, and then how that translates into what actually happens on the farm. I think I've maybe used myself a little bit too much as a case study in this way, but hopefully something from my learning and my mistakes will be useful to you all as we move into more and more uncertain climates where water variability increases and our need to be attentive and mindful and more precise with our water use increases. So this is the session overview. We have an hour and a half together. I want to invite you to interrupt me at any point with questions if something is unclear, or to share your experience. If you just have a story that you're like burning to share and you need to get it out, feel free to say it out loud. Feel free to use the chat. We are going to take breaks, so you don't have to just sit here and listen to me talk for long stretches, but we'll kind of alternate between me talking and us all talking to each other in small groups and in a larger group. So we'll try and mix it up. We're going to open first with a poll. So Anna, if you want to cue that up. I would love to know, just from the people who are in this room, those of you who are commercially farming or who have experience with commercial ag, to let us know how you are using water on your farm, because we know there are a variety of different ways that people do and can, and you might have to choose only one, but I'd like you to choose the one that feels the most important, or that you think you use the most water on this one task or for this one purpose. And that will help me kind of gauge what to emphasize in the talk that comes next. So this is great. Thank you. Those of you who have answered so far, those of you who haven't, Jennifer, I see you driving. Do not answer the poll. Okay, so we've got a bunch of people using water in their greenhouses and high tunnels. Quite a few bit of people who are irrigating the field, which is interesting and cool. Got some livestock folks who are getting water to their animals. We've got people washing equipment and washing actual products coming out of the field. Nobody is using it for frost protection, or maybe not as their biggest use. That is really interesting. All right, we've got 31 people who have responded. I am going to suggest that we end the poll, and I think that will share the results. Right, Anna?
I've just shared them.
You did. Okay, thank you. So there you go. All right, so I am going to gear this talk a little bit towards field irrigation then, and some high tunnel irrigation as well. But I think that is a very helpful way to frame it. All right, so water management plans, which are kind of the technical aspect of today's session, are not terribly common, I would say, unless you have got an award through NRCS, through EQIP or AMA to do increased efficiency on your farm with existing irrigation systems or for new irrigation systems. They are, I think, going to become more and more relevant and useful for everybody to have for a variety of different reasons. One, as I alluded to a little bit earlier, with climate forecasts being what they are for our region being the Northeast, is kind of what I'm thinking for the purpose of this evening. We know that things are going to get warmer. We know that in the Northeast, we're expecting more water overall, but that the way that water comes, either intensity of rainfall or spaced over the season, is going to be highly variable. We basically need to be prepared for handling a lot of water all at once, and then potentially stretches like we had in 2020 of very little water for a long period of time. We need to be able to handle both. And to do that effectively, we have to kind of increase the nuance with which we understand the crop, water, soil interactions that are happening on our farms. There's also, obviously, I think, a concern and a need to understand how our farms are interacting with the natural ecosystems in which they exist, their agroecosystems. So balancing conservation needs with agricultural needs is, I think, a high priority, and a water management plan that makes sure that you're only using as much water as you need, but that you are using enough water can help you get there. There's also, with changing conditions, concerns about changing supplies. This is less of a concern in the East than it is in the West, but it's still something that we should be attentive to. And there is, I think, one of the things that we have to think about in the East, we have big water users in municipalities, in industry, and agriculture is actually comparatively a smaller water user. If we lived west of the Mississippi, that would be a different story. Agriculture is a huge water user out west, but here our competitive use is really with population centers. And in keeping with that, as conditions become more variable and hydrologic and hydrogeologic systems change, there's the potential for regulatory enforcement and access to funding for programs to change over time as well. And agriculture, I think, as an industry, and we as farmers and people who support farmers need to understand what we need in order to do the type of farming that we want to do. And right now, I think that's not the case. I think a lot of people, including myself, don't really have a great understanding of what our water needs are in the Northeast. Okay, so that's the big picture. That's the preamble. Let's talk now about the ingredients of a water management plan. There are 4 ingredients as I see them. Or maybe I'm just hungry for dinner and everything sounds like a recipe. I don't know. So the first step is you need to understand, as I just mentioned, what the needs are. So how much water do your crops need, or how much water do your animals need, and when do they need it? And that seems like a very straightforward question, but it's actually quite hard. I would love to hear anybody in the chat who feels like they have it really dialed in how much water they need in a given year or a given growing season. The second step is to understand what your sources are. This might be a little bit easier, but there's still some information that I think we might have in generalities, but we could be more specific about, like how much water could I pull from the river that runs by this field or that field? What is the capacity of my well? What is the safe yield of my well, which means how much can I draw out of it before it starts to deplete the aquifer? So what the sources are, whether you need to develop new water sources or think about redesigning your water sources is an important component of a water management plan. The third ingredient, or the third step, would be the delivery system. So in tonight's talk, I'm going to spend a little time in each of these 3 areas The delivery system, I'm going to say up front, I'm focusing more on like that endpoint delivery of the different kind of big buckets of irrigation systems. I'm going to focus a little less on livestock because that's not as much my area of expertise. But I will say that it's very surface level, it's very cursory because, you know, we could have a whole session just on pump and sizing your pipe and the number of beds that you can irrigate off of a certain number of gallons per minute. That's, you know, that's a whole other level of detail that maybe we will have a follow-up session sometime. The fourth step that is important in the water management plan that I'm not going to treat as its own distinct part of the presentation, but more just kind of talk about how it's interwoven in each component, is what the regulations are that apply to getting water from where it is naturally into your field and accessible for your plants or accessible for your animals. All right. So how do you figure out what your crops actually need? We're going to focus on crops for this portion. Obviously, what you're growing really determines how much water you're going to need. There are some really thirsty crops. I mean, I think about tomatoes, right? Like they have huge biomass, they have huge leaf area. Those leaves are all transpiring. Fruit are really wet, like it's in the ground for a long time. That kind of crop has a huge water need. Something like baby greens, short window that it's in the ground, small leaf area, small biomass, much lower water requirement. So what you're growing really determines how much water you're going to need, both in terms of how much a plant needs at any given time and the amount of time that you're growing it. Environmental conditions also, of course, play a huge role in how much water you need, how much rainfall you're getting, what the temperature is out. And those two things together really heavily influence evapotranspiration. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with that term, we're going to talk about it in the next couple of slides, but I'll just briefly say, you can think of evaporation as being the water that is kind of evaporating out of the soil. Evapotranspiration is water that's moving from the soil, transpiration is the water that's moving from the soil up through the plant and out through the plant leaves, out through the stomata, kind of into water vapor. And evapotranspiration is the whole package. And then your soil characteristics and conditions. Thank you, Meg. Good time check. Soil characteristics and conditions obviously matter as well. Clay holds on to water a lot more effectively than sand does. And of course, there's a lot of stuff in between. All right, so I already mentioned crop evapotranspiration. So it includes, as I said, water loss from the ground through evaporation and loss of water through the plant itself. In general, people use ET as a irrigation cue out west quite a lot. I think we could use it more here, but it is difficult to calculate. You do need to have a handle on some basic soil science and things like be able to track regularly when precipitation is arriving, how much water you got last night in that rainstorm, etc. So it's both the soil conditions and the weather conditions that will help you calculate that. But there is a shortcut. You don't need to do it yourself. I love to point people towards the Climate Smart Farming program at Cornell. They have a suite of tools that were developed in collaboration with folks at Cornell in the Climate Smart Farming program and the folks at the Northeast Regional Climate Center, which is a NOAA station based at Cornell. Art D'Agostino is an amazing climate scientist who made a bunch of these tools that are very, very useful. Meg is going to make these slides available to folks after this session. So the link here will be live and you're welcome to follow it or Google this and play around with it. But the nice thing about it is you can change the soil rating that you have. You can change the crop type. You can put in a date for when you planted the crop and when your last irrigation was, if there was any, and it gives you a season to date and a 30-day outlook for what your irrigation needs might be. So it's generalized, it's not specific to your location, but it's very helpful. If you need to bypass all of that, the rule of thumb is 1 inch of water a week. And when I say inch, I'm meaning an acre inch, which is the amount of water that it takes to cover an entire acre in 1 inch of water, which is roughly 27,000 gallons. However, that's the rule of thumb. We know that not all crops need just 1 inch per week. Sometimes they need more. I love this resource put out by UMass Center for Agriculture, Food, and the Environment. It's a lovely fact sheet that breaks down different categories of vegetable crops and when their needs are highest for water, and also when you need to be cautious of overwatering. I think probably everybody has seen cabbage that has been overwatered and split. So I'm going to whiz by this a little bit quickly to show you just one more table. It comes from that same resource, which breaks it down a little bit more specifically by crop and when the most critical period of water might be. So the idea is when your crop is in that most critical period, that you then bump up the amount of water that you're either giving them or you know, taking into account how much water is coming down through rainfall. I have a lot of people who want to know, however, if they have water resources that are enough to grow a particular crop. And to do that, evapotranspiration isn't going to help you necessarily, because that's a point in time measurement. If you're trying to forecast ahead or think long-term about your water needs, it's helpful to kind of build yourself a spreadsheet that estimates when your crop is going to need that kind of standard 1 inch of water per week, and when it's going to need a little bit more. So I put together a mock table, like I would suggest doing for any crop that you find is like one of your central, most economically important things that you grow. Obviously, if you're very highly diversified, you can't do this for everything that you grow, but I do it on an acre by acre basis. Whatever your kind of irrigation unit might be, if you're irrigating 1 acre at a time, like try and estimate based on everything that you grow in that acre, for example. All right, I'm a little bit over time, but I'd love to pause here and get people connecting with one another and talking. So I have a series of questions for you to consider. You're about to go into breakout rooms, about 4 or 5 people in a breakout room, so you all have a chance to get to know one another and do a little talking. I'm going to put the questions that are up on the slide in the chat, which means that they should still be available to you when you go into the breakout. Feel free to use these as a guide to your conversation, or if you would like to talk about something totally different, that's absolutely fine. All right, I'm going to hand it over to Anna to cue the breakouts. Anna has another quick poll for us. Which I would love it, Anna, if you wouldn't mind throwing up there. I'm curious to hear, for those of you who do use water for either crops or livestock, what your source is. So the general sources, we heard in the discussion, there was some rain barrel, some talk, but for this poll, I hadn't thought of that. So we've got deep wells, shallow wells, which are less than 100 feet deep typically, dug wells, ponds, streams and rivers, and municipal sources. I probably should have also put delivery trucks on there, but that's less common. So we'll give folks a couple more minutes, or sorry, a couple more seconds. Looks like the majority of folks so far are using deep wells. Some folks drawing from ponds. All right, that looks good. Okay, so a bunch of deep well users. I love it. We can close the poll now, Anna. So what I'm going to talk about here are just to give kind of the beginner's overview of what the options are and some things that you need to have in your mind when you're considering developing a new source for your irrigation or for getting water to your livestock. For folks who are already irrigating, you likely already have a source figured out, which is great. However, maybe that source isn't working out for you. Maybe you need more than it can provide. Maybe you want to move away from surface water, and I'll explain why that might be advantageous in a minute. But this is really kind of geared towards if you were to develop a new water source, what are your options and what are the pros and cons of each? So the first thing I'll mention is pumping from streams and rivers. This is a shot of the Intervale Community Farm. And they draw on the Winooski River quite a bit for a lot of their irrigation. I've done a fair bit of research down at their place with the wonderful collaboration of Andy Jones. One of the things that I really appreciate about their system is that they are really practical about when and how they are moving their irrigation pipe. But this is a good shot of their intake pipe, which you can see out in the middle of the Winooski, some of their larger main line that leads out to their various vegetable fields. This is the red shot in the middle is a Netafim water meter, which I believe somebody was talking about, maybe it was Ben, was talking about tracking how much water came out of a well. This is a version of a water meter that you can ham lock into your irrigation pipe and keeps really accurate track of the water that's moving through that piping system. It is something that you can hook up to a digital meter that can be kind of beamed up to the cloud if you want it to. We didn't use it that way. We just took manual readings, but it's a really well-designed piece of equipment, and they come in a variety of sizes. So this is a 6-inch pipe, but they can go down to, I think, 3/4 inch meters. This whole system is run off of a PTO pump, so they had to bring one of their tractors over every time they wanted to run the irrigation, which worked for them because they had a big enough fleet of tractors. It might not work for everybody. Like I said at the beginning, I'm not really going to talk about pumps in this talk, but this is one of the critical pieces of any irrigation system, really, but absolutely if you're pumping out of surface water. Pumping from public surface water comes with the need to be really attuned to what your state laws are. So I pulled out Maine laws and Vermont laws here because the hosts are MOFGA and NOFA Vermont, so I figured maybe the bulk of people on this call would be from those two states, but I do know that there are folks from New York here and beyond. So bear with me while I pay special attention to Maine and Vermont for just a minute. In the surface water regulatory world, there are statutes that apply to the laws in any given state. In Vermont, it's a riparian right state, or it used to be. Now it's a common good state, public good, forgive me, which basically equates to you're not allowed to pull so much water out of a public water body that you diminish other users' ability to also use that water. That has generally not been a huge problem in states like Maine and Vermont, where we've had a lot of sufficient rainfall that has recharged public water bodies. However, it's not necessarily always the case, and I'm sure lots of people had ponds go dry or saw rivers really go down in level in 2020 and 2016, and I think we can look ahead to the future and anticipate that there will be more years coming up where we see diminished surface water. In Vermont, as folks likely know, there is recent regulation that is come into effect that also requires reporting for folks who are irrigating out of public surface waters. Specifically, anyone who draws more than 10,000 gallons within a 24-hour period, which, as you might remember when I was saying that most crops need 27,000 gallons in a week. If you have a whole acre of crops, you can see that this 10,000 gallon limit is really quite a low limit. So you'd have to be a very, very small operation not to hit it if you are pulling from surface water. How states determine what is overdrawing from streams and rivers can be a little bit complex, but is also, I think, really helpful to understand. Basically, departments of environmental conservation are concerned with there being enough water in a stream or a river to support aquatic life. So the way they measure that is by measuring the flow rate. And you can do this yourself And in some cases, it's kind of good to have this experience. But what it involves is stretching a tape across the river or the stream, taking measurements of the depth to the bottom of the riverbed, averaging them out, and then doing that again a little bit further upstream, placing an object, watching how quickly it flows down, and doing a calculation to estimate the cubic feet per second that are flowing through that water body. There are some pretty cool ways. It's not terribly complicated, but you have to like to go out and get muddy. So I put a link for some step-by-step instructions. Kind of fun. In Maine, we use a little bit of a different system known as the seasonal aquatic base flow, sometimes locally the August low flow. Basically what this does is it essentially does the same thing. It estimates what the flow would be in a given stream or a river at the point when it would be at its lowest. So August is theoretically when those systems have the lowest amount of water in them. There are also different classifications of water bodies in Maine, and I put these up on the screen so you can see what the actual law says. It's worth getting guidance, I think, from your respective Department of Environmental Conservation. Nick, I see you've unmuted. Do you want to add something there?
Oh, no, I'm sorry.
Oh, okay, never mind. We'll keep going. Feel free. If anyone is more knowledgeable about this than me, I do welcome you to interrupt. The other potential that you can irrigate out of if you are looking at surface water as your primary source are ponds, obviously, and lots of people have ponds on their property or a pond nearby that they can pull out of, or they're interested in developing a pond. I will say that when you are preparing to develop a pond, you have to be very careful about where you do it, because if you interfere with a free-flowing stream or a river, you are probably not going to be on the good side of your Department of Environmental Conservation or Protection. And if you are siting a pond anywhere near a wetland, you're likely going to need a permit to do that. And part of the reason that this is particularly important for folks who think they might want to take advantage of federal funding in the future, like NRCS programs for cost shares for climate smart practices or what have you. If you build a pond in a wetland, you basically disqualify yourself from all NRCS funding in the future or FSA funding. So you want to be careful not to make that mistake. Another thing that is possible is that people often create networks of ponds that they can irrigate using. So if you're growing over a larger acreage and you have a pond over on the west side, but you have crops that really need that water on the east side, you can invest in the pipeline structure to get your water there. Another option is that you can build a secondary pond, and if you need to, you can pump from one pond to another. And some larger farms find that it's useful and strategic to do that, or maybe they will pump out of a river to fill a pond and then have the pond serve as a holding area for that water for when they need it. Surface water in general is not the most reliable when it comes to droughts, however. So that's something that I want to represent really clearly. I did a survey with several extension colleagues and some folks at MOFGA as well in 2021. So right after the 2020 drought year was really tough on a lot of people's systems. And we asked people if they irrigated or if they used any of these, various different water sources, and then whether or not those water sources ran dry or were diminished in 2020. And you can see that the folks who said that they used ponds with natural recharge, the second line up here, as their primary water source, which is the dark orange, or their secondary water source, which is the lighter yellow, that a good chunk of them did. So the alternative then, if you're not going to use surface water, is to use groundwater. Groundwater is typically something that you access through drilling a well. The most common type of well in the Northeast is a drilled bedrock well. What that means is you put down a pipe into essentially the bedrock itself. You kind of situate it down in there. The bedrock does not hold water, but the cracks and fissures in the bedrock do. So how far you have to drill down to get access to enough of that water depends on where you are and what the depth is to that refusal where the bedrock is. The issue with this is in the Northeast. Oops, I got ahead of myself. Let me back up for a second and say this slide is like a typical well that you might either install in your farm or for your house. They're essentially the same thing. This well is a high capacity well. And a high capacity well is one that can pull more than 100,000 gallons per day. So it's just a huge volume of water. If you are siting one of these wells, you're probably running a very large operation. So in Maine, up in Aroostook County, there are a couple farms, I think, who have these. These are not things that you put in lightly. They're very, very expensive, and they are very controversial in some parts of the country, especially in places like the Ogallala Aquifer, where people apply for permits to just pull enormous amounts of water out of an aquifer that's being diminished very rapidly. So the issue with bedrock wells in our part of the country is arsenic and arsenic contamination. So it doesn't take very much arsenic in order for it to cause health problems. The current EPA limit was lowered very recently to just 10 micrograms per liter, which is not very much. And you can see on this map, this was a study that a colleague of mine at USGS did quite a while ago in 2003, looking at the occurrence of arsenic in private groundwater wells in our region. And you can see Maine, New Hampshire, and to some degree Vermont and Connecticut are particularly vulnerable to this. Wells tend to be more susceptible to arsenic contamination when the bedrock that they're being drilled into is really high in calcite, and when the pH in the water is very high. Those two things make the arsenic very available. pH is generally found to be higher in groundwater that sticks around for a long time. So if there's steady movement through the system, the pH tends to be lower and arsenic tends to be less of an issue. In general, the USGS has a lot of great information about groundwater available. Groundwater is a lot harder to gauge what's going on than surface water, right? Like you can go out and look at a river and be like, oh, wow, that's getting low. It's been hot. Oh, geez. Groundwater, harder to see, harder to understand what's going on. I think the thing to remember is that your groundwater and your surface water are actually all part of the same hydrogeologic system. They're not separate. They are kind of unified and they interact with one another. I do recommend looking at the USGS National Water Information System. It provides some really interesting long-term monitoring on wells around the country, but they have wells in the New England all over the place. And you can get these very detailed maps that show you water level depth from surface to the top of the water level in a well over time. So if you're concerned and you're trying to compare year to year, like, is a well in my region kind of holding steady despite the heat, or is it actually going down? You can do it by looking at probably not your own well, but one that's close by, or one that you can kind of use as a reference point. They also have a very spiffy dashboard that has stream gauges, groundwater conditions, spring water levels, water quality information, as well as some climatic information like precipitation and atmospheric conditions. It's a really, really cool place to go and muck around in the winter months. However, how is it actually useful to you in your planning process and creating a water management plan? If you're thinking of developing a new water source, it can be really helpful to go back and look at the data for wells that are close by you over time, and to see how they perform in some of the driest conditions or some of the wettest conditions. So it can give you a sense of how reliable putting in a new system in your area might be. It also allows you to understand what aquifer you're a part of. And they have a feature where you can set customizable alerts so that you can see when there's a flood coming at your stream gauge that's nearby, or when water levels get low enough where they might indicate that there's like a serious drought happening and you need to start conserving your water. And those can be very specific to your particular situation. The last type of well I'm going to talk about. Say that again.
There's a couple questions in the chat. Did you want to take some time to ask these now, or maybe after, before the breakout groups?
Yeah, let me do a quick spin. Can climate change fuel increasing temps cause an increase in pathogens in water? Yes. So pathogens are organisms. A lot of them enjoy warm conditions. Things like E. coli do well in warm. Basically, E. coli, salmonella, oh gosh, it's been a long time since I did my food safety work. Those do well in warmer conditions. Things like listeria is a cold weather pathogen, so they are not particularly benefited by warmer weather. But yes, there is a concern that climate change can worsen pathogens in water. It's all about who poops where, essentially. What pH creates arsenic risk, numeric value? Kathleen, I will have to get back to you on that. I do not know off the top of my head. Janelle, you asked, can they only be used on solid pipe? Because I missed it when it came up. Can you remind me what part of the conversation that was in reference to?
The NetAFM meter that was on the
no, you can't. The smaller versions you can put on polypipe. You just have to they have like a threaded connection, so you'd have to do like a threaded connection and then a barbed connection to put on a polypipe, but they totally work if you get the right size. Okay, cool. Good to continue. All right, here we go. Shallow wells. I'll try and be fast because I know people like talking to each other. This is a design. I've talked about it at different MOFGA conferences before. I know the designer, Joe Ayotte, has also talked about it in MOFGA forums before, so I'm not going to belabor this, but essentially what this is a new design for a shallow well. It's 25 feet deep, so it's not like a dug well that you go out and dig with a shovel. But you can dig it with a backhoe. You don't need like a well drilling rig, which is kind of amazing. It's a 25 by 25 by 25 foot pit that you lay a big well screen down in the bottom. For those of you who don't know, well screen is a PVC pipe with very thin slits cut in it that allow water to trickle down into it, but not sediment. So you lay that well screen at the bottom, you put a riser on so that it comes up to the surface, and then you fill it with gravel or crushed stone that's an inch and a half in diameter, roughly. And then you cap that with a landscape fabric or a geotextile, and then you put native soil on top of that as a filtration. And then when you walk away from it, you can see in this picture on the slide, this little white cap right here. That's, ooh, no, go back. That's the well. So even though it was like this big giant pit, it doesn't really look like anything when you're done. But what it does is it basically simulates an underground pond, an underground aquifer, because water comes in from the side of the pit itself and fills in all the spaces in between the crushed stone. So it's a new design. I'm part of a team that's trialing it in a couple different places to see how it performs in different conditions. Very low arsenic exposure. So in places where there is concern about drilled wells, this might be a reasonable alternative. This diagram is in here just to illustrate that there really is an interaction that happens between irrigation and the ecosystem. So I think a lot of times people think, oh, well, if I'm drawing water out from the ground, it has a less noticeable effect on ecosystems in streams, or the fish and the critters that live in streams are less affected. That is true, but it's also true that even if you're irrigating using groundwater, you are affecting all of the hydrogeologic systems and ecologies around you. This is a study that looks specifically at temperature, but we know that temperature influences a lot of other dynamics. So for example, in this first frame, this is pre-irrigation, so no irrigation is happening. You see there's water coming down from the sky, precipitation, there's evapotranspiration, and then the water that percolates down through the soil gets recharged into groundwater and then becomes part of the stream flow again. When we irrigate out of the stream, we're basically taking that water out of the stream and increasing the rate of percolation and groundwater flow. That cycling keeps the stream water cooler. When we pump out of groundwater, we sometimes inadvertently raise the temperature of streams because we are reducing that groundwater flow into the stream. Does that make sense? It's not like a don't do this, it's bad message. It's more just a understand that everything is connected and irrigation does affect ecosystems no matter where you're getting your water. All right, so let's say you have a farm that is close enough to town where you could actually tap into a municipal system. First of all, really cool for you in a lot of ways. You don't need to invest in a pump. Your water testing is handled by your municipality. The downside is that you have to have a meter on your system and it costs you money, right? And that there might also be competition with other users in your area. So some of the components that are required if you're going on a municipal source are water meters, isolating valves, so if you need to, you can shut the system off from the main line, and a backflow preventer, which basically stops anything being contaminated in your irrigation system going back into the main system. Generally, people are charged to use municipal water, and this will be true for anyone who is on a municipal system for your house as well. You get charged by the water district, which also includes, like, if you're attached to a sewage service from the town. You can get a reduced bill if you work out an arrangement with them and tell them that you are irrigating, because that lowers their cost. They're estimating the burden on the sewage system based on how much water people are using. But if that water is not going back into the sewage system, then it can reduce their costs and they can reduce your bill. The last source of water that I'm going to talk about before we go back into breakouts is water delivery. Definitely not the cheapest option. Sometimes there's no getting around it. Your well runs dry. You can no longer pump out of a stream or pond because of either regulatory limits or your pond runs dry. There are water delivery services, bulk water haulers, and in general, non-potable water is the cheaper option. I'm going to end this section by just kind of tipping my hat to FSMA. I think probably many people in this room are aware of it, but for those of you who aren't, the component of FSMA that is important for those of you who are irrigating or otherwise watching produce is the produce safety rule. The produce safety rule has a section on agricultural water, which is water that comes into contact with produce that is typically eaten raw. So it's not agricultural water if you're using it to water potatoes. And it's not agricultural water if it's water that you are using to water your livestock. But it is ag water if you're irrigating your baby greens or if you're washing them. There are specific water testing requirements. They involve establishing a running test sample. Not all farms are called covered by the rule, but covered just means not all farms have to comply with the rule. It's based on your gross sales. So there's a timeline depending on the scale that you operate at. And that is all I want to say about FSMA, but I'm happy to talk about it more actually if people do want to talk about it more. Okay, I'm done talking for a minute. You guys talk, go back into your breakout room. The questions that we thought might be useful at this point in the session are now in the chat. And I will turn it back to Anna. Oh, and we'll do another 10 minutes. I'll say that out loud.
Hey, Rachel, we're running a bit short on time, and we're wondering, did you still want to do the breakout group either way? And if so, would we want to shorten it?
Those are great questions. I think let's give people the chance to talk, and I will try to be more succinct in the next section.
All right, I will send you all off and send you a time to return.
Leave enough time for further conversation. All right, so pretending that you are designing a new irrigation system and you are starting from scratch, what are you going to do? The things that I encourage people to think about when they're getting started with irrigation. There's still a lot of people out there in the Northeast, especially, that don't irrigate yet, but I think most people will need to in the near future. There are different systems depending on what your intended uses are. So I mentioned that frost protection was a use at the top of the hour. It doesn't seem like a big one for this crowd, but it is a really useful and important use of irrigation water. Seedling establishment, obviously, people also use irrigation for desalinization, less so up here, but more of an issue down in the mid-Atlantic. And then also, of course, for all sorts of crops and livestock. The things that you need to know before you can really design an irrigation system well is the total area that you need to get water to, the water efficiency of your soil. So we were just talking, Mark was just talking about the amount of water that healthy soils can hold. That's a big piece of it, but in general, we make estimations about water holding capacity based on whether or not you have silt or loam or sand or clay or some proportion of those. The efficiency of your application, which I'll talk about in a second, the fuel efficiency of your delivery system. So pumps have different fuel efficiency that they operate at. Labor availability, we talked about a little bit. Ben was saying, you know, it takes away from other activities. That's a really important thing to consider. The available capital you have to invest in the system and maintain it. And also your topography and the location of your crops relative to your water source. So I'm going to run through a couple of different delivery mechanisms just to kind of represent the full spread of what's out there. In general, I think the delivery systems are more common or less common based on the scale of your operation. And for those of you who are interested in livestock, I apologize, you are not well represented here, but I see you. I just don't know how to help you. Center pivots are those, you are all familiar with those pictures of the big crop circles out west. Those are center pivot irrigation systems. We do have them in the east. We do have them in Maine. They're very common up in Aroostook County. This is kind of a bird's eye view of the one. And I think what's important to kind of understand is that the center of every center pivot, there is either a well or a water delivery mechanism here, and then the water travels out along this long arm to the furthest reaches of the circle. It drops down these tubes and comes out at the sprinklers, which can be adjusted for their height and for the amount of water that they put out and the size of the droplets. It's actually really interesting technology. Another alternative for larger scale operations, this is something that some of the large scale blueberry growers use up here in Maine, are big gun sprinkler systems. They usually are connected to pretty large lines, 6-inch aluminum main lines, and then there are lateral lines that come off. In general, one of these covers an entire acre of crops, but they are quite labor intensive to move pipe. You do have to take the guns off every winter, and they are not cheap. They're $600 pretty much an acre, so $600 for one gun plus all of the piping to get it set up. The thing that I learned today that I did not realize is that they can also be used for livestock cooling, which when we think about climate change and we think about the effects that it has on all of the agricultural systems in the Northeast, livestock overheating is something that needs to be thought about. An alternative to a big gun system is called a hose reel system. You've probably heard of this, but I wonder how many of you have seen them. They look like robots to me. They're actually kind of charismatic. So the reel is here up at the top, this big green thing. They come in a variety of sizes. The smallest ones you can pull behind an ATV. The biggest ones you need like a large truck to haul. But the gist is there's a large hose on the reel. You connect it up to your water source. And then you pull this little mechanism that you can see on the bottom picture out across the field. And then you turn on the hose reel and it very, very slowly winds itself so that the traveler, the sprinkler, kind of moves slowly across the field, irrigating as it goes. It only works if you have flat topography. Smaller sprinkler systems that are appropriate for smaller cropping systems. Some of the benefits are that you can DIY them. You can build them out of PVC that you can get at Lowe's and Home Depot. A lot of the same components that you would use for like a maple sugaring operation, these little red ball valves, work well for this type of do-it-yourself sprinkler system. The heads can either be these articulating, rotating sprinklers, or you can use mini wobblers or wobblers, which you might have seen. Basically, the water kind of sprays up and hits a cap and gets shot out, usually in like a 30-foot radius or a 10-foot radius, depending on the type of head that you get. They do take a significant amount of time to move around, but they are portable, which is one of the appeals of these systems. And then, of course, drip irrigation is the preferred approach for super water efficient applications, not appropriate to all crops. It gets water right to the base of the plant, which we love. However, if you're growing things that are direct seeded and require good coverage in the soil, carrots, mesclun greens, probably not appropriate, probably not as useful. There are a variety of different types of drip tape that you can use. One of my favorite aspects of drip tape is pressure compensation drip tape. If you don't use pressure compensation drip tape, you're probably going to get some areas of your field that are getting nice and wet, and some areas that are dry just by the like mini ebbs and flows of your land. Pressure compensation kind of helps even out that distribution of water down the bed. There is also subsurface drip, which you can see in the picture down below. It's installed on a semi-permanent basis, so it's not permanent, but you can put it in there and leave it for a couple of years. It's generally a thicker plastic, and it's supposed to stay put for quite a while. Hard to deal with leaks, like you got to dig a hole and patch a leak underground when you find one, as opposed to drip tape that's at the top where you can see when something has chewed on it and there's a hole. The downside of drip, obviously, plastic. I used to save a lot of drip tape on my farm until I learned that it was a really great way to spread soil-borne diseases around the field. So there is that risk. All right. The last, I hope this is the last thing to say about this, is that, like I said, there are lots of other components to an irrigation system beyond just the delivery mechanism. Sizing your pipe, sizing your pump, getting a pump that runs on the type of power you want. These are all really great things to think about before you invest in a system. I have a fact sheet linked at the bottom here that's about getting started with drip irrigation that takes you from water source all the way to the end of the drip tape. But there are also lots of other great resources out there if you're thinking of designing a different system. If you go with something like a center pivot or a hose reel system, things that are higher ticket and you generally have to go to a dealer to purchase, they generally have design services in-house, so you don't have to do that sizing. They have engineers that will make sure that the pipe is right, the pump is right, the distance that you're trying to take the system works. They can figure that all out for you. For things like micro sprinklers and drip tape, there are some companies that will help you price that out. They will also like to sell you your supplies. Those services don't generally exist as like standalone services, but you can figure out how to do it yourself. If you are interested in increasing the efficiency of an existing irrigation system, there are resources available, financial resources available to help you do this. Specifically through NRCS, there's a lot of funding coming through the Climate Smart Agriculture and Forestry funding pool. This is Inflation Reduction Act money that is targeting growers. Take advantage of it. So once in a lifetime opportunity, the amount of money that is coming through the IRA for agriculture. And irrigation, especially making irrigation systems more efficient, is one of the ways to reduce fuel use and therefore agriculture's contribution to climate change. So it is critically important. Thank you, Layla. Yes, I only have the figure for Maine in front of me because I'm on the Maine Technical Committee, but I'm glad to see there are other states that are also making these funds available specific. So there's a specific pot for irrigation, and then there's another pot for climate smart activities. Just work with your NRCS agent, go into your NRCS office, tell them what you'd like to do, and they will help you. I do believe that EQIP is only designed for improving the efficiency of irrigation systems, but that AMA is for installing new irrigation systems. But if somebody knows better than me, please feel free to correct me. Putting things together in a water management plan is a formal step. I think it's a great thing to go through, but it also requires you to have a pretty high level of knowledge of your system. The NRCS Irrigation Water Management Plan is available, and we're going to send it around afterwards. I would say take a look at it and see if you want to use it as a template. The state of Maine is going to make funds available to farmers to put in new water sources in the coming year. They will require a water management plan as well that will likely be similar or a pared down version of the NRCS water management plan. So this is something that I recommend getting comfortable with because it might open up additional avenues of funding and financial support in the future. One of the things that can be really useful so that you don't have to work on this from scratch is that the Maine Department of Agriculture, Conservation and Forestry developed a water management plan estimation tool to give you a lot of the numbers that you need in order to really effectively use water for crops on your farm. My colleague here and I have picked it back up, and we're trying to update it to reflect more contemporary background information like precipitation norms and things like that. We are currently looking for farms who might be interested in using it to basically sit down with us and go through it and tell us like where they're getting stuck or where it makes sense, like what's good, what needs to be improved. And hopefully we'd be turning this into eventually a web platform that would be open access and anybody could use. So if you are interested in helping us do that, we're offering $100. Please follow up with me. And we are almost down to the end, so I am going to forego my brilliant Jamboard activity and just tell you that if this piqued your interest and you want to know more, that I'm facilitating, not giving all the talks, but I'm facilitating a full day ag water management workshop next month up in Orono in Maine at the Wells Conference Center. The registration info is coming out soon, but we're going to cover a lot of different things. We're going to get more into the climate change parts of water management, talk more in depth about NRCS water management plans, source development, calculating crop needs, et cetera, et cetera. And that is all I have. I'm really curious to hear what you all are thinking about or what is popping up in terms of questions.